I thought it might amuse you to begin with if I just showed you the US cover to this book and the British cover. They're actually different, and it does show, I suppose, how marketing can rear itself even when we're trying to write objective history. This is the US edition, and both books have exactly the same painting on the cover. It's John Singleton Copley. It's actually a scene from Gibraltar, which reinforces one of the points of the book about the global nature of the war. But it's a scene of one of Britain's only triumphs. It's actually the longest siege ever withstood by the British Army that lasted 4 years. Needless to say, the British tended not to paint their defeats. So there is no series like John Trumbull illustrating the American Revolution. But this is a detail from the painting. The painting itself is like a life-size mural that was kept in Gibraltar for 40 years from the Second World War. And in many ways, the Yale cover reinforces a perception that the book is written against, since you basically have two leaders. The senior one, who's actually called Augustus Eliot, looking very imperious, pointing into the distance, much like a sort of Sir Laurence Olivier character. And Olivier, in fact, did once play Burgoyne, pointing into the distance, and his junior commander looking up at him, and as a friend of mine once said, looking quizzically as if to say, "Are you being serious?" It also has my full name with my middle name. Jackson was my mother's maiden name, but my father had read the Arthur Schlesinger biography of Jackson, which was very uncomplicated. It mentioned nothing about Indian removal, and he was an admirer of Andrew Jackson. And finally, the subtitle is slightly different. It's British Leadership, and the very last part is The Fate of Empire. This is the British cover, and as you see, you've got a rugby scrum of redcoats, looking very victorious. They even wanted to change the title, pointing out that no one in Britain is interested in defeats. And my middle name has disappeared because they were worried that I might sound American. And then the subtitle was changed. Instead of British Leadership, it's British Command, which has a slightly different tone to it. And instead of The Fate of Empire, it's The Preservation of the Empire. And there was a figure in the corner, almost looking Christ-like, being crucified, who's also disappeared in this view of the painting. Now, this clearly was a war, seemingly, that Britain should have won. Britain had just fought what, in this country, we think of as the French and Indian War. In Europe, it's the 7 Years' War, in which it had been victorious, which made it a global power. It not only acquired Canada, but also Bengal, which gave it its main foothold in India. It went on to win the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars. In other words, the American Revolution was an aberration. And one of the favorite popular ideas of why the British lost was through ineffective leadership. And I'll come back to this later, but that's why I decided to look at the problems of waging the American Revolution through the 10 key decision makers, both political and military, because I wanted to stress that military decisions are not made in a vacuum. They're often political imperatives as well. And I essentially introduced these 10 figures in biographical cameos, much like a play. Collected biographies, certainly a form used before, but these are collected biographies written on a timeline. Each figure is introduced when essentially they become key to the decision-making, key to the plot. The main problem is obviously it involves some repetition, but often worthwhile reinforcement, and often looking at a particular moment like Saratoga from several different perspectives.